Hi everyone, welcome to the Community Classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and what we're going to be talking about is an often overlooked dynamic related to reparations, and it's the truth study. And so we're going to talk about the importance of a truth commission in this dynamic related to reparations and ADOS and even CARICOM. And so we're going to look at first is this dynamic of legal discovery. We're going to look at why truth commissions are important, how they function, what they focus on. We're going to look at the rationale, and then we're going to look at some examples related to why a truth commission is integral to this process. And so before you even get to reparations, you have to have insight. And so you have to have this process of discovery, because once you get that insight, you'll have a better understanding of what the damages have been, what the historical reality actually is, and what repair would be needed in order to most effectively move forward. And one of the major reasons why a truth commission is very important for American descendants of slavery or descendants of American chattel slavery, and even for CARICOM descendants, is because there are some historical dynamics that need to be clarified in order for people to understand their place in the world and the history of what has taken place in terms of their ancestors and in terms of where they are today. And one major focus today is going to be on dispelling some of the myths that people have had over the course of time regarding the history of surnames in America and also in the islands. And so there is a presumption that the surnames of people who identify as Black, African American, Afro-Caribbean, those individuals tend to have a narrative, and they've been given a narrative about where their surnames came from, and it tends to involve a slave owner and an assault of a great-great-great-great-grandmother. And so we're going to dispel some of those myths and look at some of the other explanations for these surnames and another way of looking at the history. And as a quick reminder, if this appears on anything other than Dr. Tracey McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. Okay, so one of the things we're going to start off here with is the construct of legal discovery. And discovery has a position in both criminal law and civil law, and particularly in what's known as intellectual property law. And sometimes people think about discovery and they think about this idea of the doctrine of discovery, particularly when we're talking about colonization and slavery. And so when individuals attempt to advance an idea about the doctrine of discovery, they might talk about locating something and citing something, unearthing something that purportedly had not been located and cited before. However, there's another way of looking at discovery, and discovery in the law is about truth seeking. And so it's about uncovering information on all sides and sharing that information as appropriate. And so one of the ways that this is done on an international human rights level is through what's known as a truth commission. And a truth commission would be integral to any process talking about reparations for those understanding themselves as ADOS, and also those understanding themselves as American Indian. And so those identities are interrelated, actually. And so one of the things that the Truth Commission is for is that it is to hopefully get to the truth about history and clarifying history, and it's also looking for reconciliation in many instances. And so one of the ways to think about the House Bill 40 is to conceptualize it and perhaps advance it and encourage it as a truth study. And this truth study could be done as a plan for understanding what needs to be done in terms of repair. But sometimes we put the cart before the horse. And so if you don't have discovery, you don't have adequate information about the exact nature of the harm and the exact nature of the repair that is required. And so that's why HB 40 can be so important in that process. And another thing to think about with HB 40 is perhaps it would be best to have a sponsor who is actually someone who is identified as ADOS. And so that would definitely be helpful, and also perhaps perhaps trying to get something going through the Senate. And you can also, think about individuals who may not be ADOS, but who are invested in understanding the truth of our collective histories. And by collective histories, I mean the whole world. And so the whole world is involved in this whole dynamic related to HB 40. And so it's kind of hard to leave the whole world out when we're having this discussion. And we're going to first look at what is a truth commission. And so a truth commission basically is a commission that is authorized by a sovereign, meaning that a nation state authorizes the truth commission. And the purpose of it, the way it functions is it's looking for truth and also seeking to address historical revision, serves as a function of justice and memory correction, and also recognition for what has taken place. And so it is often seen as a first step in reparation. Now, it's a temporary commission, but what they do at the end of the truth-seeking mission is they render a final official report. And so an important thing to remember about Truth Commission also is it focuses on the past. So it's not focused on ongoing issues of injustice. And so it's focused on looking at the past, trying to get a better understanding of how we got to where we are today. In terms of how the Truth Commission functions, basically what it does is it focuses on discovering and revealing past wrongdoings. And these wrongdoings can be by government or even non-state actors. These are usually bigger non-state actors. And so it can look at things that are going across oceans, to get a better understanding of past wrongdoings. Because again, remember, this isn't about the current state. It's about understanding history. And so part of the function is to resolve conflicts that are left over from past times. And so the Truth Commission can function by reviewing global records. This means that they can, look at records in different languages even. They can take global testimony, so they can get testimony from people who are all over the world. And what they can do is, when they're doing the Truth Commission, is they can investigate past patterns. So they can look into the past, try to get a better understanding of what was going on in the past, and also try to uncover the truth when the past has been clouded or shrouded or is a little murky. And so for ADOS, the Truth Commission would be essential. And it's essential because one of the issues, and this is CARICOM also, is that this complaint of descendants, that they have no historical record in terms of their history sometimes. And you also have a situation where history appears to be revised in some instances, and so it's unclear about the history. You have people who don't even understand themselves as being connected to their past, related to their names even, and cultures stripped away from people, and people being colonized and enslaved. And so there are a lot of dynamics going on, and also issues in times past of even state-sanctioned terrorism, crimes, human rights abuses, and that's all over the world. And so we're looking at Africa, we're looking at Europe, we're looking at the Americas. But one thing to remember is that the Truth Commission is not about prosecuting the deceased bad actors or human rights violators. It's really about getting this historical clarification, and that would be the focus of a Truth Commission. And some people might be wondering about this idea of a Truth Commission because many people haven't heard of one before, but it is pretty commonplace in instances of human rights abuses. So when you have situations of terrorism, or you have violations of human rights, apartheid, slavery, there have been many nationalities that have held truth commissions. And you have Morocco, you have the Congo, you have South Africa, most notably. You have Australia, Germany, Canada, Guatemala, Chile. So lots of places have done truth commission processes, and so it would not be this unusual thing to do this for the American descendants of slavery. In fact, because there are so many examples available, there are other places that can lead the way in this process. Probably, presumably, South Africa or Canada might be able to provide significant guidance, because those entities have dealt with similar situations. And Canada, of course, has dealt with doing truth processes for their indigenous population. And so let's look at the rationale for having a truth commission in this particular instance. There are a few things that give rise to this. First, I want you to take note of the picture up in the upper right-hand corner. And up in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a number of individuals who are of Igbo descent in Nigeria, West Africa. And they are wearing traditional Scottish garb. And so most people don't tend to think about Nigeria and Scotland, but clearly there is a significant connection, modern day connection. And so you can see how histories evolve, and sometimes people don't understand those histories. I know there's been a lot of discussion about men, particularly men of color, black men, wearing in the United States, wearing skirts lately, and this idea of feminization related to these skirts. And so there's something a little bit more going on, perhaps because often the skirts are black, and often the skirts have that sort of tartan plaid. And so there is some indication that there is some sort of cultural dynamic going on there. So rationale for the Truth Commission, particularly when you have instances of all of these evolving histories, is that you have conflicting macro histories, meaning conflicting world histories. And you also have evolving micro histories. And so as people are doing ancestry work, they are uncovering all sorts of things that they didn't know before. They had identified according to a particular history, and then they're finding out that the history that they had been holding on to all of these years is not perhaps the truth about their history. There's also a dynamic where identities have been alternating, and so it's almost been sort of, again, we talked about this before, the shell game of names. And so what you have are people, and you can see it now more clearly as people sort of migrate around the world. As people migrate around the world, they are actually taking on different identities. So they might have started off in one continent, they move to another one, then they take on a totally different identity. And when you get 100 years down the road, those descendants perhaps will not even remember that they even had roots in that other place, and the people will take on the identity of wherever they are at that time. And so you can have a person who's from Guatemala, they move to Canada, and after 100 years, their descendants will be identifying themselves as Canadians versus being from Guatemala. Okay, so another dynamic that has been going on is historical revision. You've got iconoclasm, you've got, some people might remember the conflict about the Confederate statue removal. Sometimes people don't understand that even though they feel a little sensitive about something, that when you start to remove statues and things like that, you actually start to change the history of a place. And so we do have this dynamic of historical revision that gives rise to a need to investigate truth a little bit further. And also when you have things like artifact removal, so there's a lot of removing of artifacts from Africa and America, and so it makes it difficult to keep a really nice clean history in order to understand this history of ADOS. There's also one other unusual, highly unusual thing. West African cultures, the ones that are on that coast now, they have strong oral traditions. And what is really odd is that when speaking with individuals of West African descent that are continental nationals, they don't tend to have a tribal, an ethnic, a family oral history related to anything touching on or concerning enslaved family members. And so they don't have an oral history of this slave trade that took place that would suggest that their family members were taken away and enslaved. And that's very odd because many of them have an oral history that, says they came from the East. So they have very detailed oral histories about their history, about their travel, about their migration. But there seems to be lacking this history of enslaved family members, given how big this issue is. And so often they will sometimes, only understand the slave trade once they've landed in the United States. And so that's a little odd in terms of history. So it would be important to uncover, the history in Africa, the understanding of what happened to the people who were enslaved in Africa and why there is this gaping period in terms of understanding the personal historical narrative in terms of the nations and the tribes and the ethnic groups in Africa. There were also parallel slave trades going on. So this makes things very confusing in terms of where people came from and just the evolution of the slave trade process, understanding people's histories. You've got slave trades going across the desert. You've got slave trades that are kind of up in northern Africa, down in south, central, western Africa, Europe. So you've got a lot of things going on simultaneously. And so it would be really great in terms of understanding what's going on with ADOS and individuals in CARICOM. It would be essential in understanding the truth about those histories. You also have notably ancient Afro-Eurasian lineages in the Americas and Africa. And so you have individuals who are descended from very ancient groups. And so it would be probably helpful to know if having those lineages mixed together might have given rise to some of the challenges that we have faced as a world in terms of the transatlantic slave trade and other things. And so it would be helpful to parse that and get to the truth about some of these ancient lineages, because clearly if you have the Igbo who are in tartan plaid, clearly there's perhaps a historical narrative that that is not clear at this point, but clearly there's something going on in terms of that history. And so also the Truth Commission, or Rationale, is it helps to determine damage. And so it takes the onus of responsibility off of the individuals to, fully understand exactly what took place. And then it gives the opportunity to understand better the totality of the circumstances and what the damage is and what needs to happen in terms of repair. And so again, for many people, many philosophies, the first stage of reparation is actually the Truth Commission. And so the truth in and of itself serves as a dynamic of repair. So let's get started with this example of why it's important to have a Truth Commission in this situation related to reparations discussions and ADOS and also CARICOM. At one point in time in history, in colonial history, on this side of the water, birth became a crime. And it was a certain type of birth that became a crime in and of itself. And it was primarily what was called non-marital birth, or what we call non-marital birth now, and also birth of children in forbidden marriages. And so particularly there were laws related to what was known as mulatto. And so there were laws related to having a child out of wedlock or having a mulatto child. And how a mulatto child was defined was very interesting, because it basically meant any type of mixture. And so it could have been Cajun or Creole, what you think of as Cajun and Creole today. And so it could be white, black, it could be Indian and European, European and African, Indian and African, and who was understood as white/black actually changed based upon whoever was defining it. And many people were often classified as mulatto when that was not necessarily their actual identity. In fact, that was an identifier for Indian. And so some of you who are doing your research and you keep coming across family members who were mulatto, generation after generation of mulatto, that is often the reason why. So now we're going to look at a family tree dynamic so that you can better understand the importance of this dynamic of making the birth of a child a crime. And again, we're going to go into this with a lot more depth in a different video related to ancestry and legacy. But for now, we're just going to look at it in terms of how it played out in slavery, because what happened was once that child was deemed the manifestation of a criminal act, the child was usually enslaved. And so you would see things in the literature such as child was bound out, the infant was bound out. And so oftentimes the mother would also be bound out. The father could also be bound out simply because they had a child together who was of mixed race or not of a sanctioned marriage. And this could happen very frequently if the couple happened to be American Indian, or if the couple was any mixture. So you could have European and African, you could have Indian and African, you could have European and Indian and African, and that in some instances would give rise to what is known as mulatto bastardy. So you had a number of dynamics going on here. So when people are talking about, all of these people who should be cut off from being ADOS, you have to be careful, because until you've gone back into your family history very clearly and understood what was going on, you might actually talk yourself out of reparations, okay? And so one of the ways that this worked was you could have, and you can see in this family tree, and it doesn't matter who's on the other side of the family tree in terms of the father's side. We're just going to look on the mother's side right now. You could do the same thing for the father's side. It doesn't matter which side you do it for, because you're going to come up with the same dynamic where you get to this enslaved individual as a child. And so you can see where on this one side, on the right side, all of the family members going across at the bottom initially. So you have the mother's Negro paternal grandfather, mother's Negro paternal grandmother. Then you get into mother's Negro maternal grandfather. But if you see in the corner, you have mother's quote unquote white maternal grandmother. Many people do not understand that they have a grandmother, and it doesn't matter whether you're identifying yourself as white or you're identifying yourself as mulatto or you're identifying yourself as black. It doesn't matter. Many people have in their family trees individuals that are not clear. And in many instances, some people do know those family members are there and they are just pretending that they are not there. And that often occurs in white passing situations. But it can also happen because people are glorifying melanin now. And so you can also have this situation. But in many instances, what was going on was not some male slave master assaulting a great-great-grandmother. It was often a grandmother who happened to be white or classified as white, married to a grandfather who happened to be Indian or happened to be classified as Negro. And so what would happen in those situations is the child from that union would be identified often as biracial. And if that child, for instance, then was with someone else, married a person who was identified as Negro, then or Indian, the likelihood that next child would be identified as Negro was great. And when you're living in a situation where you have codes that actually criminalize being black or allow people to be enslaved simply because they're identified as Negro, you create a situation where people simply being born becomes a crime, and people being enslaved is the manifestation, in terms of the outgrowth of this quote-unquote crime. And so if you have a chance to get to a library and start looking through books, you can start to see where there was so much land given to settlers and they needed help. And so the easiest way to get this help over time was to create laws to enslave people so that they could then have this free labor. And so they were enslaving children from birth for 7 years, that indenture that you hear about. They would enslave children for 7 years and then enslave them for another 7 years and enslave them for another 7 years. And before you know it, that child's life is over and they've been enslaved for an entirety of the child's life. And of course, because there was a philosophy of the child's status follows the mother. And that pretty much changed at one point, but you have in some situations that the child's status would follow the mother. And so you could have two quote unquote biracial children, one with a quote unquote Negro mother and one with a quote unquote white mother, and those children would have different outcomes in terms of one being enslaved and one perhaps not being enslaved. And so while a bigger scale truth commission is going on, it would be important for people to start to do their own micro level truth commission with their own families to understand the truth of those situations. Now, of course, things like this, if a truth commission is done well, then it would reveal all of these things openly for all of the members of society to have if that's what they want to have. And as you know, we have discussed in the past this issue of understanding those surnames and where your surnames came from, and also trying to get people to understand that oftentimes the surnames that they have are their family surnames. This is very difficult for many people who identify as Black Americans, Native Black Americans, Indians, people who identify as, Caribbean. People have been given this story for so long that all of their names came from some slave master. And so people feel like that's not a part of their identity and they actually had an African name before. The fact is that everybody didn't come from Africa. That's really difficult for some people to accept, but when you start to do your legacy research, you start to do your ancestry research, you will come to discover that this is accurate. And so one of the things that people need to address and start to really look at is this idea of where these surnames came from and how they got the identities that they have. Again, many people have been really believing this story that every single Black person in America, every single Black person in the Caribbean for the most part, particularly Jamaica, where you'll see things like a 25% European heritage, or in America you'll see a similar thing. And so people sometimes really believe that that came from quote unquote slave master. Sometimes it perhaps did, and sometimes it perhaps did not. And so what we're going to look at here is for free African Americans of Maryland and Delaware. If you've been looking at the screen, you can already see that there is a long list in this book of families in this history that descended from white women. And so these families with these surnames, these are not individuals who descended necessarily from quote unquote white males. They descended from quote unquote white women. And the list is extensive. And so if you're just listening and you're not looking at the screen, I'll address a few of these names. Again, the list is extensive. Last names, Maryland and Delaware, from the colonial period until 1810, you have last names such as Allen and Anderson and Bass and Banneker and Cannon and Bryan and Collins and Clark and Carr and Cambridge and Cook and Cox and Cunningham and Davis and Dawson and Ford and Fortune and Evans and English. You have Dobson and you have Fountain, you have Gannon, Grace, Graham, Harris, Harrison, Hamilton, Hill, Hicks, Holmes, Hopkins, Howard, Hughes, Jackson, Jones, Knight, Lee, McDaniel, McMaden, Madden, McGee, Mitchell, Morris, Murray, Myers, Nelson, Newman, Norman, Perkins, Parsons, Osborne, Phillips, Price, Proctor, Ray, Russell, Rustin, Rogers, Roach, Scott, Shaw, Taylor, Stewart, Strickland, Stanley. And there are many more, so whenever you have time, you can stop the video at this point and you can review this. And this is also going to give some of you who are doing some searching and you have roots out of Maryland and Delaware, this is going to give you some leads in terms of understanding your historical narrative a little bit better. And so just as another example, there's some information about migration from Maryland to other counties. And there's a note related to Benjamin Banneker in this book, and it indicates a member of the Hubbard family, a descendant of a white woman who had a mixed race child in Westmoreland County in 1705, married a sister of Benjamin Banneker in Baltimore County about 1760. Their children obtained certificates of freedom in Loudoun County, Virginia in 1795. And then it goes on to talk about families who originated in Maryland but were counted in the 1810 census for Virginia. So this might be important for some people. And it again lists some family names. You have Easter, Fortune, Grace, Grimes. You have Lamb, Nelson, Nichols, Pickett, Ridgway, Webster, Trout, Strickland. And so there are a variety of names there also. So that might also help some people who might be a little stuck, and this might be some helpful information, because often when people are looking through these records, they are not, if they are considering themselves ADOS, they are not necessarily expecting to see quote-unquote white woman in their narrative, and often they will expect to see that ancestor is descended from a slave master, and so they were property on a slave plantation. And so it's important to, again, keep your mind open in terms of those historical narratives and understanding that history, particularly given the criminalizing of simply being born. And so you can have a resource related to looking at your surnames and understanding when your surname entered the United States. You can look online and actually research your surname, see when it entered the United States. You can look at the origins of it, when it was in Europe or wherever it came from. And you can get a better understanding of, how your surname came to be and how you might have come to have this surname. This will also help you in terms of getting some leads in terms of where you might want to trace your surname back to. And so this might make it a little easier. So there are several resources online. You can just type in your surname and type in surname, and you will find a number of resources. And so when you look at this surname King, for instance, you can see that it's a name that dates back to Anglo-Saxon tribes of Britain. And so you can see a little bit more history on it. You can see, when the surname moved. You can actually see when the surname entered a particular place. And so you can see here the migration of the name. You can even see when this last name entered the United States. And so you can see 1620, very quickly, this name emerged in the United States, starting with Samuel King and Henry King, and you've got Daniel King and Alan and Alice King and Dorothy and Ann King. And off to the side, we have some more examples of that tartan plaid that is worn by individuals in Nigeria, particularly the Igbo, and some Scottish individuals. And here's another example using the last name Harris, and you can again look and see the resources related to Harris. You can see when the name was originated, where it originated. You can also see how it has moved around over time. And here are some examples of how the Harris name has migrated. And so you can see when the name entered Canada, when it entered the United States, when it entered the Caribbean, and you can get an idea of how that family has migrated over time. You can see when the family entered the United States in particular. That will give you some idea of how far back you can trace your roots also. And so you will see, the year that your family's name entered the United States, and then you can sort of trace it back to an ancestor. And the likelihood that the people who have that last name are unrelated is probably pretty slim. And so there's probably some relation somewhere along the line, given that there's usually a starting point for the surname. And then you have individuals who come over after that, and they tend to come from, the same regions. And another example is the name Cromwell, and so of course that's a very important surname, and so you can actually trace that surname and see how it came over. It of course has some nobility or royal roots here, and so individuals who have that surname, you can often trace that surname back down the line, and you can see when it entered the United States or the Caribbean or Canada or other places. And here you can see Cromwell, and you can see when the name Cromwell entered the United States. Looks like it started in about 1634, and you can even see the name of the Cromwell family that entered the United States. And you've got Samuel Cromwell entering in 1634. And so you have, again, another depiction, speaking of Cromwell, speaking of Scotland, you have another depiction of the relationship between Nigeria and Scotland here. And so you can see, again, the bagpipe players and in their tartan plaid. And so one of the things that's important to note is that sometimes the wearing of those kilts by a number of up-and-coming artists may be related to something other than feminization. It's just another thought. And this is just to give you a little visual of what some families look like in times past. People were not necessarily as devoted to race and skin color as people might be led to believe today. And so you had a lot of variety going on. And one of the things that Chief Warhorse talked about in one discussion was this idea that when you increase international trade, when you increase these interactions with different cultures, you're going to increase the probability that people are going to marry and mate across cultural lines. And so you can see the manifestation of this here. And so it's not just a black and white issue. You have Asians, you have Indians, you have a variety. And so you need to keep your own mind open when in terms of looking at your history and then understanding our history on a macro level. This is also why it's important to sort of turn down some of the talk about who should and should not receive reparations until people have a more clear understanding of the truth, hence the Truth Commission. Given the fact that the history of ADOS, those individuals who are identifying as American descendants of slavery, given the fact that the histories are so confusing, one of the most important things that can possibly be done for healing, for repair, not only for those individuals, but for other individuals, the most important thing for repair must be the truth. And so while a number of people might want to sort of rush forward and move to this idea of repair, it's really important to understand the nature of the damage. And understanding this actually requires looking at the historical narratives in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, and in America. It's said that truth is stranger than fiction. This might be the time to test out that theory. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.